So I'm going to give a talk on evolutionary theory and a Catholic understanding of creation. And just to give an overview, we'll try to cover all these things. We'll see, in terms of the time. I don't want to go too long. We'll try to end on time and have time for questions. I want to start with talking about what is creation from a Catholic perspective, and then what is evolution from a scientific perspective, because I think a lot of people's preconceived notions of a conflict between the two have to do with people not understanding or what somebody else means by the term creation or what somebody means by the term evolution. So I want to talk about those just briefly at the beginning. Then I'll give a short overview of the church teaching on evolution, which is relatively brief. Then I want to talk just briefly about natural selection, because it plays into some of the questions I'll get to at the end. Then I'll talk a little bit about hominin evolution and what we know about that, how the fossil record in the last 7 million years leading up to modern humans, in interactions with other hominin species, particularly Neanderthals, and what the data looks like there. And then finally get to some theological and philosophical questions about evolution. And the two that I'm going to focus on are ones that I tend to get the most amount of questions from students, and that's sort of why I wanted to focus on them at the end. One is monogenism versus polygenism, and how the church talks about that, and how this sort of fits, or how you can sort of reconcile the two in terms of what modern science shows and what the church has said about this. The second is order and purpose in evolution, and whether there is any, and how you can make a case for that. Based on, people have this preconceived notion that evolution is just a bunch of random chance events, so there can be no purpose. And I'll tackle that from a philosophical and a scientific perspective. Okay? So when we talk about creation, this is not an exhaustive list, but I always want to hit these 3 points because they're key when we talk about a Catholic understanding of creation. The first is that the universe owes its existence to God, right? That it is dependent upon God at every moment. So it's not that, it has a beginning, God started it, and then walks away. It's like the universe is, at every moment, just like every one of us, is being created by God. Without God's creative power, we would cease to exist, okay? And the second thing is that studying it reveals God, right? So studying creation and understanding it is going to tell us something about God. And that's in the Catholic tradition, the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, right? So understanding evolution should, if done properly, if integrated properly, should help us and bring us closer to God, right? The second is that we owe our existence to God, and this is both individually and as a human species, right? So God deliberately intended to create us. It wasn't like he started an evolutionary process, looked down about 200,000 years ago, and wow, there's some hairy hominids running around Africa. How'd that happen? But no, this is that from the beginning, when God created, that was the intent. He had a lot of intents that was going to happen, but that is something. And then when he creates every individual at conception, that is, God intends for that person to exist from all eternity, right? And then the last point is that God created man in his own image, right? And in that is this the dichotomy that is man, which is there's that we see over and over again in these debates, is that we are set apart from the rest of creation in the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, unlike other creatures, right? But at the same time, we have an earthly body, and we can't ignore that fact, right? We have a spiritual soul, and we have an earthly body. And together, trying to integrate what that means. What does that mean for the human person is sort of what the heart of the creation evolution, not debate, but integration effort is, okay? So when we look at that, this I don't think any of these are inherently in conflict with the science of evolution, okay? Not all of them fit, like a hand in a glove, but there's no inherent conflict that's on its face irresolvable, okay? Now, when we talk about what is evolution, right, a lot of people use evolution, that term, to mean a lot of different things. And I want to focus on sort of 3 ways it's used scientifically first, and then on a way that's used philosophically, okay? So some people, when they use the term evolution, are referring to historical evolution. So that means that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, If you look back at the organisms that live on Earth, if you look 500 million years ago, there's going to be a certain set of organisms. That's going to be different than the organisms that you're going to find in the fossil record 200,000 years ago, which is going to be different than 50 million years ago, and so forth. Okay? All it's saying is that there's organisms that have changed, that exist on Earth, have changed over time. Some have gone extinct, and that the Earth is old. And there's certain pieces of evidence that could demonstrate this. So dating the rocks, finding fossils in certain layers that we know are this old, can give you a good scientific evidence for historical evolution. Okay? The second level is a common descent. Somebody referred to common descent evolution, right? And this is the idea that all organisms are connected via common ancestry. Okay? At this level, you're not explaining how this common ancestry can be explained. You're just saying that they're all related by common descent. Okay? And there's another sort of set of evidence that you would have to assemble to make this point. It requires historical evolution to be supported. So it's sort of a layer of a cake. One layer depends on the other. So common descent depends upon historical evolution being correct. I think one of the best pieces of evidence for common descent, not so much universal, but at least for the tree that we're going to be looking at, if you look here at the hominid branches here with humans and modern chimps and the other great apes, one of the best pieces of evidence for common descent is things called process pseudogenes. Right? So a lot of people use DNA evidence, the similarities in DNA and genes and so forth, but I think this is the best because there's no functional reason for this. You can't explain this by, well, this is just the best function, then God made everything the best way. So process pseudogenes, just briefly, is that you can see up here, I'm going to walk over here and just point this out. So here's a gene on a chromosome, and it's got these exons and introns in it. So when it gets converted from DNA to RNA to make the protein here, you splice out the introns. In the average human gene, there's about 9 to 10 of them. But you get this processed RNA right here. Right? And this is usually used to make a protein. But in some cases, this thing can be converted back to DNA by an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. And when it gets converted back to DNA, it can be reinserted somewhere else in the genome. Now, this process pseudogene can't be used because the instructions to turn it on are not there. Right? Because those instructions to turn it on are only in front of the gene over here. So when it gets inserted over here, it's sort of useless. And what happens is over time, it starts to decay. Mutations will accumulate in it. They're not going to be selected for or against because they're neutral. So it accumulates mutations at a regular rate. And based on the number of mutations that have accumulated, you can figure out the age of these, right? So they're not only non-functional, but you have a way of determining how old they are. When did they first originate? And if you look at the more recent ones, there's one pseudogene. It's about 11 million years old based on how mutated it is. Right? The most recent one you find in the exact same place in humans, chimps, and gorillas. Some of the older ones, this one here is about 25 million years old, means there's more mutations have accumulated in it. You see it not only in humans, chimps, and gorillas, but also in orangutans and rhesus monkeys. So the older ones you find in a more diverse group of primates. So there's no functional reason for these here. There's sort of dead DNA that's been inherited. And I think the best explanation, most parsimonious explanation, is that it occurred once and a common ancestor to all, this one here, this process pseudogene occurred sometime about 36 million years ago in the common ancestor of all these and was inherited by all of them. And there isn't, the only other way to explain it, so there's usually just ad hoc ways of explaining it. So the simplest, most parsimonious is common descent. Right. The third use of the term evolution, I refer to Darwinian evolution. Right? And this is the level where I think most of the conflict arises, although some people have problems with all three of them. Right? But this I think, is where most of the conflict arises. And this is where you're talking about the mechanisms. Right? So Darwinian evolution is that common descent that we just talked about can be explained by natural mechanisms. Okay? So pure Darwinian evolution would say natural selection is the only mechanism. Very few biologists believe that. Most believe that it's the most prominent mechanism, but there's other natural mechanisms as well. But the key is it's natural causes that scientists can study would explain how the common ancestor of modern humans and modern chimps split, and on this lineage, changes occurred via natural selection to get to modern humans. Okay? All three of these are scientific theories. They're making scientific claims about the material way that the human body evolved and how it's connected to other organisms. What becomes a problem often in literature is when you start to use evolution in a different way, right? So the term evolution becomes problematic in this debate when it's used as a philosophy, right? So you have the atheistic Darwinian philosophy, which says the human person is nothing more than the product of evolution. So it's saying, yeah, natural selection, so in the previous slide, right, we say, well, Darwinian evolution say that natural selection is the primary mechanism by which the human body evolved, right? But then if you add to that, and that explains everything about the human person, right? It's one of those theories that is nothing more. We're nothing more than that. That denies the reality of the immaterial aspect of man, and is obviously not a scientific theory. There is no scientific experiment that you can do to demonstrate that that position is correct, right? And so often scientists will say evolution demonstrates God doesn't exist, or there is no soul. Well, science can't demonstrate any of that, right? Can't go and do an experiment to demonstrate the reality or immaterial, reality or non-reality of the human soul, the reality or non-reality of God. And this is where the conflicts start to arise. But it's not a science-faith conflict, right? It's a philosophy versus another philosophy conflict. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? And that's what the church has stressed, right? So in the next section, we're going to talk briefly about what the church has said about evolution over the years. And you're going to see that's what it's focused on. It's not endorsing the scientific theory. That's not the business of the church. But it is, say, when scientific theories overstep their bounds, the church is going to warn about those. Okay? So there is no official church teaching in the sense on a scientific theory of evolution, saying, yes, we have to believe in the scientific theory of evolution, or no, we don't. There is no official position that you're going to look up in the catechism and find this is what the church says about evolution, right? The church, in papal documents, has stated that evolution as a scientific theory has merit, okay? But it's not endorsing it. It's not saying that this is a useful or this is the correct, not the best term for scientific theory, but it's a good scientific theory, right? However, it consistently condemns cases in which theories of evolution masquerade as bad theology. And you see this over and over and over and over again. Right? So Darwin wrote Origin of Species in, the first edition came out in 1859. And that wasn't the first sort of theory of evolution, but it was the one that was probably the most well supported by observation in the 1800s. And for the next 100 years, there isn't an official Vatican or papal statement on evolution, right? Now, it doesn't mean that the church was happy with it by any stretch of the imagination, right? Particularly the Jesuits in particular just thought it was, heretical. Yeah. And so, by and large, I think there was a lot of people in the church concerned with it, but there was no official statement condemning it. And the first time it's mentioned is in Humani Generis in 1950, right? And I missed it earlier in the week, so I don't know if you've gone over this or read this at this point, but this is Pope Pius XII, and this is in no means is this a ringing endorsement of evolution, if you read this, right? So the teaching authority of the church does not forbid that in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology. Research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields take part in regard to the doctrine of evolution, which means the theory of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existing and living matter. There's a couple things here. First, you notice that he's saying it's okay to discuss, and you have to discuss it in an integrated fashion. Right? It's not scientists telling us what's going on or theologians telling us, but it's scientists and theologians, people that are knowledgeable in both fields, having a dialogue, trying to understand how these might fit together. And he makes the point that it inquires into the origin of the human body, into the physical human body. And he goes on, and then a few sentences later, to say any theory of evolution that denies the spiritual soul is not one that a Catholic can accept. Okay? And again, that would be a philosophy. Pope John Paul had a much, this is almost 50 years later, 1996, had a more, I say, warm reception to the idea of evolution, right? But again, he's not endorsing it. He just says, a half a century after the publication of Humani Generis, new knowledge has led to the recognition of more than a hypothesis in the theory of evolution, right? Again, no endorsement, just saying this is an interesting scientific theory. He talks about how people in all various disciplines all seem to be converging on one sort of idea. Therefore, it's something worth exploring even more. But then he does say later on, the theories of evolution, which because of the philosophies which inspire them, again, philosophies about evolution, regard the spirit as either emerging from the forces of living matter or a simple epiphenomena of that matter are incompatible with the truth about man. So again, consistently, this is what you see. You saw it in the beginning from Benedict as well. And this is my favorite quote about evolution. I put this up in all the classes I teach about evolution to undergraduates, both bio majors and non-bio majors. And this is, it really gets at the heart of it, is that creation and evolution, as much as these things correspond to two different realities, you can't say either or. The Genesis creation account does not in fact explain how human persons come to be, but rather what they are, right? What is it to be a human person? And that's a different question than the biological question is how did the human body evolve? Those are two different questions, but they both affect what it is to be human, right? So they're both important questions. We want to understand the human person, all right? So to that extent, we're faced with two complementary rather than mutually exclusive realities. And I think that is the way, the best way to move forward, looking at and framing how you look at this. Okay. All right. So what I want to switch to now is talking briefly about natural selection and just sort of illustrating what it is and what it isn't, okay, as a mechanism for driving evolutionary change. Okay. So what is natural selection? Natural selection is, it's not a thing, it's really an emergent property of the biological, chemical, and physical world, right? So when we talk about evolution via natural selection, you can't talk about an individual evolving, okay? You can't talk about a population evolving by itself, all right? Populations evolve, but they're going to evolve in the context of an ecosystem, which is in the context of a chemical and physical world that they're in. So it is an emergent property that anything is going to go through natural selection if it meets these criteria. And these criteria are a relatively robust set of things that you can find not only in the natural world, but you can create these things in a computer simulation, right? So you have to have individuals in a population that vary. Anytime you have individuals in a population that vary, right, in some respect, and some of that variability is heritable, right? And we know a lot of our variability, the differences between you and me and other people in the room, is heritable. Some of it isn't because of environmental things, because you were fed better when you were a child than I was, and so you grow bigger and so forth. But there's a good deal of the variability from person to person that is genetic, right? It's heritable. All right. So like in this example, neck length is controlled partly by the genes one inherits in these giraffes, and they have different sized necks. All right. So some individuals in each generation are better at surviving and reproducing, right? So there's going to be some competition for survival. Now that doesn't always occur, right? There's many situations we have an entire population where there's really very little selective pressure. There's plenty of food around, and so even individuals that are, you would think, well, they have 3 legs, so they should be weak, are going to be fine because there's just plenty of resources in there. But there are many cases, in most cases, in most environments, where there is some competition for survival. Right? Then if the heritable variation, in this case, say the neck length, is important for survival, if it's a trait that actually gives you a benefit survival, the population will evolve. Right? But you see that this is, it is an emergent property of a population that is in an ecosystem where there's competition. And that depends on what type of competition, depends on the other species that's there, depends on the environmental factors, but it also depends, and we'll get to this later, it depends critically on the chemistry and the physics of our universe. That has a critical role in determining evolutionary pressures and what works and what doesn't work, okay? And so that's why you don't see flying elephants, right? There's a physical reason you don't see that, right? So there are certain things that are limited because of the physics and chemistry, and that's an important point we'll get to in a little bit, okay? So in this case, let's suppose all four of these criteria are met, and a giraffe with a longer neck, therefore, is going to have more offspring. Therefore, the population from generation 1 to generation 2 is going to change, right? The average neck length, okay? It's not as if a person with a long neck, their neck gets longer. No, they're going to have more offspring. The average in the population changes, right? So that often leads to the question with naturalism is trying to understand why certain things are adaptive. Why are they better? Why is it that a giraffe with a long neck is better at surviving, okay? And usually you think, well, the reason a giraffe with a long neck is better is it can eat more leaves at the top of a tree, right? Well, it turns out that's not really true, right? And this is probably this experiment is probably the most tedious. I'd hate to be a grad student that was involved in doing this experiment, okay? So what they did is they took a bunch of grad students and had them out there following giraffes around, and they were measuring at what height they ate. So if I'm the giraffe, if I bent down to eat, if I stretched up to eat, or if I ate right in front of me. So what you see here in this picture, like this is a female giraffe. You see almost all of its food, it's bending down. So the percentage of its bites that it was down here, right? This is in meters. And in the male giraffe, almost all of the food it ate was down. And the interesting thing they found is that even when it did this, it reached up and grabbed the leaves on the top of the tree, there was plenty of leaves down here. So it wasn't like it had to get the leaves at the top of the tree. So there's no evidence there in this experiment from these grad students that having a long neck is beneficial to get more food, at least in the year or two that they were following them, okay? Now it could be, that when there's a drought or so forth, it does become important. But what they did find is that the giraffes with the longer necks the male giraffes with longer necks were able to mate with more females. So these are the giraffes, the bull giraffes you see fighting. And so the longer neck, as they whip, this is always fun to show to students, right? So, right, so the bulls, will. Okay, so a couple things for this. One is that demonstrating what a trait is beneficial for, what a mutation is beneficial for, is not straightforward. It's not easy, but it does look like in this experiment or in this observation, at least at present, the long neck is beneficial for the giraffes, only for the men, because it allows them to have more mates, right, or to have access to more females. And because the gene for long neck is beneficial for the males, the women are going to have long necks as well because it's been selected for one sex, right? That doesn't mean that that's why it evolved, though. It could have evolved, the long neck, because it helped them eat more, because you don't know, this is just showing what it's beneficial for at this particular time. And this is one of the things about adaptations. There really is, they're context dependent, okay? Every trait is really context dependent. Now, some traits are going to be beneficial in more contexts. So there's certain traits that are going to be beneficial in a lot of contexts, but I don't think there is, and I could be wrong, and I've asked students this for years and asked for colleagues this. I can't think of a single trait that's universally advantageous, that's always going to be beneficial, no matter what, and no matter what. Even things like powered flight that's evolved multiple times. The fact that we don't all fly indicates that it's not always going to be beneficial. There's certain reasons it's not. There really isn't. Now, there are some traits that are going to be so beneficial, evolution is going to find them repeatedly, and we'll get to that later. But there is no trait or adaptation that's always going to be beneficial in any context, okay? There's always trade-offs. Okay? All right, so the next set of of slides I want to talk about human evolution and start to get into some of those questions. And first, I just want to go over what we know about human evolution. And before I get into this, this is probably a gross oversimplification. There's a huge debate amongst hominid paleontologists about how all of these fossils fit together, okay? But I want to sort of highlight what we do, the broad picture, give some broad strokes. And what I'm going to focus on is what happened along this branch. So here is a common ancestor that existed between 6 and 7 million years ago, I think. And on one branch diverged and leads to modern humans. So this is called any species that's along this branch. It's not a single lineage here. There's a lot of twigs coming. It's a really messy tree here on this branch. Are called hominin fossils. So we're going to look at hominid evolution. Okay? This other branch led to modern chimps and bonobos over here. But we're going to be focusing on this branch. And I'm going to break it up into 3 sections, 3 periods, roughly every 2 million years. Okay? So if we look at this, I'm going to stress one thing about the entire picture, and then we'll break it up into 3 sort of sub-pictures. The first is that if you look at the hominin fossil record from this common ancestor, nobody really knows what that is, okay, or what that looked like, because the fossil record is really, really sparse 6 million years ago in Africa, up to modern humans. It is not a neat linear path like you see down here in these cartoons or the t-shirts where the ape just sort of gradually stands up. And that's pretty common in evolution. When you see a major evolutionary transition, you don't see a nice, neat, linear progression. What you see is more like a bushy tree, where there's all this weird experimentation going on with this form. And then out of that bushy tree, 1 or 2 twigs emerge, and everything else dies off. You not only get to see this here in hominid evolution, you see it in the origin of tetrapods, the first 4-limbed animals that eventually are able to support their body weight outside of water. You see it in the origin of birds. And what you see is almost like this rapid experimentation with the bird form, or the rapid experimentation with a hominid form. And eventually, you have a hominid that has sort of all of the traits that modern humans have, okay? Or you have all the traits that modern birds have. But it's not easy to say, well, A evolved to B, it evolved to C, to put them into that picture. There's 3 phases that I want to look at, okay? The first is the base of the hominid tree. The second is the diversification of hominins in Africa. And the third is probably the most interesting and the most complex, is the waves of hominins leaving Africa, okay? So they're roughly each 2 million years in length. So you can think, the first one is 6 million to 4 million years. African diversification, 4 to 2 million, and then the waves out of Africa from 2 million years to the present, although it's not exact, but it's close. Okay? So the base of the hominin fossil record, this is the sparsest portion of the record. From 6 million years to 4 million years ago in Africa, there isn't much in the hominid fossil record. Right? So we don't know too much about what happened. So the 2 major fossil finds, this one S. chigensis, there's only been a handful of fossils. There's no bones that are post-cranial, so it's all cranial fossils. There's nothing below the head. And that's an example of one up there in the top there. Had a very small brain, about the size of a Coke can. So your brain is 4 Coke cans, like cans of Coke, and so this is about 1/4 of that, right? And some people debate whether that's even on this lineage. Some people say that S. chigensis actually should be on this lineage going to modern chimps. Some people say it should be on this lineage. But you can see why it would be. This is a partial crushed skull, and that's basically all we have, is a few of those. The other fossil form that's found back then is this one, Ardipithecus, called Ardi. And you can see the recreation of it there in the picture, right? And then you can see the bones that have been found. Okay? You see it's not a complete skeleton. You have a partial skeleton. But a couple interesting things about this one. You can see it's got an opposable big toe, which is more like modern chimps than modern humans. So it's not fully adapted for upright posture. The brain size is very, very small. Okay? It did have a smaller jaw. So if we think about this hominid evolution, so 3 things there's more than 3, but 3 key skeletal things happen. 1, you're getting a bigger brain. 2, you're getting a smaller jaw. And 3, you're getting upright posture, right? So those three things can be tracked in the fossil record. Some you can track, some better than others, depending on what fossils you get. But Ardipithecus, you can see the arms are very long. So the arms and legs are about the same length, which is different than, that's a more ancestral character rather than a derived, a more human-like characteristic. So those are the two major fossils that you find there, and there's not much. Okay? When you get to about 4 million years ago, okay, you get the diversification of hominid fossils in Africa. And this is where the tree really gets bushy and the connections start to get more and more difficult to trace. Okay? So you have these archaic and transitional hominids. The two major species are there's the Australopithecus genus, and there's a number of species that they fall in there. Lucy, the famous Lucy, that's one of the Australopithecus. That's Australopithecus afarensis. And it had more robust adaptations for upright posture. So its arms are now shorter. It doesn't have an opposable big toe. The hip, that's a reconstruction of Australopithecus there in that picture. You can see the hips are shorter and flatter. But it's thought that the Australopithecus, in some way, there's a bunch of different species there. You can see here in this picture, there's at least 5 here on this. But some of them, somehow, with these question marks, nobody's really sure because there's sort of a mix of traits in there, give rise to the first member of the genus Homo habilis. Right? And Homo habilis was given that name because it was thought to be the first hominin species that used tools, although that's debatable now. Some people argue that habilis is just a version of Australopithecus, and some of the Australopithecus use tools. Other people disagree with that. So there's a lot of debate over where these should fall. But the Homo habilis does have a larger brain than Australopithecus. Okay? But it's still less than half the size of a modern human brain. And it was adapted for upright posture. Now, just to give you an idea of sort of the messiness in this, I just want to point out 2 fossils, and on the next slide, talk about the differences between them. So you have this Homo habilis and this one Homo rudolfensis. Okay? These 2 are contemporaries. Right? Both are found about 2 million years ago in Africa. When you find a hominid fossil, you might ask, is this one more derived or is it more ancestral? Meaning, is it more ancient or is it more like a modern human? Which one is more modern? Which one is more ancient? Well, it turns out there's sort of a mosaic. It's not an easy question to answer. So if you look at their traits, you'll find that habilis is more modern in certain traits, but in other traits, rudolfensis is. Okay? So if we look down there at the bottom, the jaws and teeth, for example, right? The smaller jaw and thinner teeth is going to be more modern, okay? More derived. And you can see Homo rudolfensis has a large jaw, which is large, narrow molars. This is more ancestral. So this one looks more like a modern human when you look at the jaw and the teeth, right? Well, if you look at the brain size, it's the reverse. Okay? Rudolfensis looks more like a modern human, has a bigger brain than Homo habilis. And if you look at the height and so forth, you see that the Homo rudolfensis looks more like a modern human. Homo habilis is shorter. So this mosaicism, it's not easy to say which one gave rise to the next hominid that was more modern. Okay? Some people even argue that these are not even 2 distinct species, that they could interbreed and they're just a subspecies. And so there's the splitters that split everything into different species, and then there's the lumpers that try to put everybody together. And so it's a relatively complex picture, and it's impossible to really determine which one is a true species, which one is. First of all, biologists don't have a agreed upon definition that works for defining what a species is, so that's a problem. And then when you look at fossils, when you only have half of a cranial, if you don't have a full skeleton, you have a third of a skeleton, it's very hard to distinguish everything. So it's a little messy there. But you can see then there's, coming out of there, there's this question mark, somehow you get to Homo sapiens. So the third sort of phase is the phase where you have these waves of hominids leaving Africa. So up until this time, all hominid fossils are found in Africa. Now people it was always thought that it wasn't until about 2 million years ago hominid fossils started to leave Africa, but now there was a recent fossil found about 2 months ago that changed that, although there isn't direct evidence. I'll talk about that in a minute. But until about 2 million years ago, I thought all hominid fossils were in Africa. Okay? And there was 3 major waves of hominid fossils leaving Africa, although there's probably actually more than that. Okay? So the first was Homo erectus. Right? This is the first hominid fossil the earliest that's been found outside of Africa. So you have a population called ergaster that was in Africa. The ergasters, the ones that left Africa and moved to Asia, become Homo erectus. Some people say these are just the same species. Other people split them into 2 species. Okay, that these are just erectus in Africa. These are erectus out of Africa. All right, but that's the first wave that left, and it's thought that those all went extinct well before modern humans made their way out of Africa. The second wave is Homo neanderthals. All right, the Neanderthals. There's a species called Homo heidelbergensis that left Africa, and those that left Africa and went to Europe became Homo neanderthals. Right? And they actually split. There's some of them moved into Asia and were another species called the Denisovans. Right? But that second wave left about 500,000 years ago. Right? That wave of hominids was clearly still present throughout the globe when modern humans left Africa. Right, so modern humans have been dated. The oldest modern human fossil that's relatively well agreed upon as a modern human is dated to about 200,000 to 190,000 years old in Africa. Right? But from there, modern humans leave and spread throughout the globe. Right? But as they go into the Levant in the Middle East, they encounter Neanderthals. Right? As they go into Asia, Eastern Asia, they encounter Denisovans, who are related to the Neanderthals. So they encounter the other hominid species. And then they also have, it's debatable, but there's been 2 fossil finds, one that came out 2 months ago and one about 10 years ago, of these hominid fossils found in islands in Indonesia. One was found on the island of Flores, and then that one was found like 12 years ago. It was a hobbit fossil. I don't know if you remember when this came out. There was Homo floresiensis. Okay? And then the other one is the island of Luzon, I think. So it's Homo luzonensis, okay? Based on the island that it was found on. But both of those were ones that they don't fit neatly because neither one of those fossils looks like erectus. All right, so the midget, the hobbit. Thank you. The hobbit fossil. People first thought, well, it's either a miniature human, a dwarfed human, which they pretty much ruled out, or it was a descendant of erectus. And they see this is the original paper, and they thought erectus. Some of the erectus that left, went to this island and shrunk and became this Homo floresiensis. But now, based on the differences between Floresiensis and they don't think that that was the case. And people argue that there might have been an earlier wave out of Africa down 2-3 million years ago that survived as Homo floresiensis. So whether that's true or not, we don't know until there was more fossil evidence to back that up. But there's clearly all these waves coming out of Africa. Now, one of the things that happened in the waves, the last wave, modern humans coming out of Africa, as I said, they encountered these other species, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Okay? And based on our ability to sequence DNA, we've been able to sequence the entire Neanderthal genome and the Denisovian genome. Right? And if you compare that to the human genome, we found some interesting things. Right? So this is, that's the Neanderthal world there that modern humans were going to encounter as they left Africa. The Denisovans would have been over here, Siberia, and then towards East Asia. Right? If you look at the genetic composition, right? So if you look at this figure here, right? There's a bunch of lines here. Each line refers to a different group. These are modern humans from Africa, modern humans from Europe, from East Asia, and then from Oceania. Okay? And if you look at it, the Europeans, the East Asians, and the Oceanic people, all three of them, if you look at their lines, are basically the same, right? And what this is showing is the divergence of their genome from Neanderthals. Okay? So what they did is they look at different regions of the genome, and some of them are very divergent, some are very similar. Right? Because after humans and Neanderthals split, there's going to be certain regions of the genome that evolve at different rates. So some are going to be more distant, and some are going to be more similar. Right? But what you find, what the interesting thing is, if you look at Africans, they have a different grouping. They are more distantly related to Neanderthals. And the most parsimonious explanation for this is that all the modern hominins that left Africa, they have interbred with Neanderthals and picked up some Neanderthal DNA, like 2 to 4%. Okay? The modern humans that stayed in Africa, because they didn't encounter Neanderthals and didn't interbreed with them, because the Neanderthals were only, we saw in the Neanderthal world in the Middle East and in Europe, wouldn't have encountered them, and that's why their line is different. Okay? If you look over there for the Denisovians, you see there's a line for a difference there with the Oceanic. So there was thought that there's a different interbreeding and interaction with those. But I think the Neanderthal one is the one that's best studied and been looked at. And they've actually been able to find, they've found fossils where they've been able to get DNA from, and they could tell that this, based on the DNA sequence, they can compare it to modern humans and Neanderthals and say, well, this individual had, was the product of a human Neanderthal interaction 2 generations ago, because of 1/8 of its DNA was Neanderthal, 7/8 was roughly human. So this is like 3 generations. So there's been multiple cases where they've seen there's been interbreeding between these, which makes you question, what does it mean to be a species, right? Because clearly humans and Neanderthals were able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, else that DNA wouldn't have survived, right? But they're still considered distinct species, right? And so what does that mean for what we use to define species? Right? And this is also one of the reasons I thought modern humans were able to adapt to the climate in Europe and into the Middle East so readily, is because of the interbred with Neanderthals who have been there already for 400,000 years. They were able to pick up certain genes that were going to be beneficial for surviving in those climates, rather than having to be there for 100,000 years before they were able to adapt. So it might have helped speed up the adaptation of modern humans. Okay, so in relation to this then, sort of that picture of human evolution, I want to talk about 2 questions about evolution in particular. And one we had up there on the slide there, up on the screen this afternoon, about the origin of modern humans, of polygenism versus monogenism. Okay? And what does the science sort of indicate, and what does the church indicate? Okay? And the second has to do with, does evolution have a purpose or goal? And can science even answer this question? Or does science have anything to say to contribute to that question? Okay? So the first, with monogenism versus polygenism, I'm going to put up, this is the quote that was up there on the slide. So this is in Humani Generis, where Pope Pius XII said, "For the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents." Right? So he's basically saying that you have to hold monogenism. Right? The Adam and Eve, there's the first parents, and everybody descended from that couple. Right? There couldn't be a population of 100 or a population of 1,000. Right? But why does he say that? Well, it's not so much that really believe monogenism is something special, but it's how do you incorporate original sin, right, into the picture? That's the reason. That's it. So it's not. If you could figure out how to incorporate original sin, then do you really need monogenism to describe what the state of being human means? So he says, so the second, I think, sentence is probably even more important. He says, "Now it is no way apparent how such an opinion," the idea that there was 100 first humans or 1,000 population, there's no way that such an opinion can be reconciled with what the sources of revealed truth and documents of the church proposed with regard to original sin. Okay? So it seems like if you could figure out a way to take original sin, like we were talking about this afternoon, and get that to fit with polygenism, then maybe that would be great. His concern about monogenism is if you get rid of monogenism, you have to get rid of original sin, right? But if you don't, then there doesn't seem to be a problem with that. Okay? So what is the problem? Okay? Well, the problem with monogenism is that the biological evidence strongly suggests that humans emerge from a population rather than from a single pair. Right? So there's a lot of evidence that points to this, but I think the best evidence is the amount of allelic diversity. Right? So if you start with two parents, a mother and a father, right? How many alleles for a gene can you have in the population to begin with? You can have 4, right? So I could have 2 different alleles, right? And my wife could have 2 different alleles for gene X. I could have 2 different versions of it. I get version A and B, and she might have version C and D. So at most, you start with a diversity of 4 in a single couple, right? For any given gene. That's the most you can get, right? So if you start with that 4, if you look at the amount of allelic diversity there is in modern humans, there's some genes where there's hundreds of different alleles, right? So going back on known mutation rates and how quickly they mutate, genes mutate and those mutations spread, it doesn't seem to be a way in 200,000 years you can go from 4 alleles of a gene to a couple hundred, okay? So that's one sort of problem with the idea. So the way to get around that, so if there was a human population of about 1,000, then you have a much greater allelic diversity, and it's easier to get to the allelic diversity that we have today. There's other genetic arguments like that that sort of suggests this. So, the question that we want to look at is, can the doctrine of original sin be reconciled with polygenism? Right? So consequently, each person is from the very start damaged in relationships and does not engage in them as he or she ought. The idea that original sin doesn't necessarily be transmitted, biologically, but it's transmitted socially, right? And if you look at the origin of the Adam and Eve story, original sin is transmitted. In the story, Eve sins, right? And then Adam sins, right? So there's Eve eats the apple. So it's not that original sin that is being transmitted. Both of them fall, but they don't fall because of inheritance, right? The second one falls because one person falls, their relationship with God is broken, and that's going to affect and make it easy for the next person to fall. So is it possible to expand that to 100? To 1,000, if you could have an original couple that fall. I'm not a theologian, I can't answer that question, but that it seems from the story and the idea of original sin that would be possible, right? The other thing to keep in mind, and this is a thing that you can't examine scientifically, is that there could be a difference between what we call theologically human and biologically human, right? So when we talk about theologically human, someone that's made in the image and likeness of God, it's not a certain bone structure or brain structure. It is what? Having more soul, having rationale, the reason, that spark of reason and relationship with God. And there's nothing in the fossil record that's going to be able to determine that. So, he said we find the oldest modern human fossil is 200,000 years old. Well, it certainly looks like a modern human, but is it, so we'd say biologically it's human, it looks like, but was it theologically human? How do you demonstrate that? Does that show up in the fossil record? Now, some of it does in terms of, if you see cave art and so forth, you're probably sure that person probably has reason and conceptual thought and things like that. But before that shows up, about 100,000 years, 70,000 years ago, who knows, right? And so that makes things sort of unknowable in that. I mean, it's even possible, and I'm not arguing for this, but if Neanderthals and Denisovans could interbreed with modern humans, are they all theologically human? I mean, there's people that make the argument that Neanderthals, buried their dead and had some conceptual thought. If they did, maybe they are theologically human, and that you have to push back the origin of theologically humans further. I'm not saying that's the case. I think the evidence for that is very debatable. Whether they buried their dead deliberately, or if the cases where they see this, they'll see like animal bones surrounding like horns of animals surrounding a Neanderthal, right? Well, it could be that's what they did, but there's a lot of other explanations for why that's the case that have nothing to do with ritual and understanding death and burying their dead. So I don't think there's an airtight case for Neanderthals burying their dead. But that's possible if you have this distinction. Okay. All right, the last thing I want to hit on is the idea of evolution having a purpose or plan. Okay, so you often hear this argument that, and I see it in students will say this, I'll see it written in articles and so forth, that evolution must be without a plan or purpose because its core mechanism is natural selection of mutations that occur via chance. That because it's dependent upon chance events, there can't be any purpose behind it. It's just sort of, you have no way of predicting which way it's going to go. It's all random and chancy. So there's no way that it could have a purpose, right? And there's two problems with this. One is a philosophical problem that Aquinas dealt with a long time ago. I'm sure philosophers dealt with before him as well. And the second is a scientific problem, I think. Okay? So the first is that there's a philosophical need to integrate chance and providence. That need is not unique to evolution. Right? So for some reason, people get hung up on chance and evolution, where there's a lot of other things that are dependent upon chance that we don't get hung up about. And we think, oh, nobody ever is concerned about that being in God's providence or not. But evolution, for some reason, because it's based on chance, well, it can't be God's providence anymore. So if you look at, for example, the sperm and the egg that made you up, the meiotic process of recombination, there's a lot of chance events that go into that. So therefore, are you not then, therefore, made in the image and likeness of God, not known from God from all eternity? So you either have to discount everything. You can't say, well, I can handle that, but I can't handle the chance in evolution. So there's got to be a way to integrate chance with providence, right? And it's not unique to evolution, right? It's at the core of every human person's identity, right? And there's an easy, a simple way that can be done. The second thing is that evolution is really an interplay between order and chance, and the order is probably more important, and the chance is secondary, and I'll get to that a second, okay? So the first, this is sort of a philosophical way of integrating chance and providence, okay? That experience is riddled with chance events, so it's not unique to evolution, right? And this quote from Ernie McMullen, because I think this hits on it, sums it up beautifully. So I'm going to read this and I'll give a couple examples. He said, "It makes no difference whether the appearance of Homo sapiens is the inevitable result of a steady process of complexification stretching out over billions of years, so as if it's like a purpose or something guiding evolution, or if it comes to a series of coincidences that would have been entirely unpredictable from the human standpoint. From our purpose, it is unpredictable. Right? Either way, the outcome is God's making, and from the biblical standpoint, could properly be said to be God's plan. Right? Terms like plan obviously shift meaning when the element of time is absent, and God is outside of time. For God to plan is for the outcome to occur. So when God creates and plans, everything happens. It's all there. It's not, wait, like you say, it's not, whoa, what's going on now? What happened this billion years? Now, everything that happens by law. Everything happens by chance. It's all under his providence, all right? So there's no interval between the decision and completion. And so it's a perspective thing. So what looks like chance to us is not chance, in a sense, in God's eyes. It is what he deems and how he deems to create. Just even on human scales, we can see that. So, I could, send my son to the grocery store, and because I want him to get married to this good Catholic girl, I call my friend who's got a girl the same age and say, send your daughter to the produce section at 5 o'clock, right? And so they bump into each other. Oh, it's a chance encounter. From my perspective of my son, it was a chance from the perspective of me, it was planned. So the chance and plan, it depends on your perspective, right? And if it's that way with humans, it's even more so when you look at God versus humans. And that, this is basically looking at primary and secondary causality, right? And the error of taking God off of primary causality and bringing him down and putting him as secondary causality. So that God is the primary cause. Anything, my actions, anything I cause is, as a secondary cause, share in the causality of God. Natural selection, chance events, scientific laws, all of those are sharing in the primary causality of God. It's all under God's providence. Okay? All right, the last thing I want to talk about is this second issue. And I think this one is more of a scientific thing. And I think it's important because I think it refocuses what is actually going on evolutionarily. Right? And there's been a debate over, particularly the last 20 years, about this thing, convergence versus contingency in evolution. Right? The difference between the two is always illustrated best by a thought experiment. What would happen if you reran evolution again? If we could go back and let evolution run again for 4 billion years on Earth, right? What would it look like? What if we could do it 100 times? Right? What would the outcomes look like? Right? And there's two possibilities, and obviously there's things in the middle, but two extremes. Okay? One is that it's really contingent. It's really based on chance events. So if you reran evolution again, you get a totally new world. Right? Totally different organisms or just single cell, it would be radically, radically different. It'd be something we didn't even recognize. Right? The second is that you would get, it's very convergent, you would get the same organisms, not the exact same, but the similar organisms again. Right? So this question of whether it's contingent or convergent hinges on whether there's some underlying order that's directing evolution or if it's mainly just chance. Okay? And I think that the evidence suggests that there's some underlying order. Okay? Convergence in evolution can, how do you demonstrate this? Well, you can't rerun evolution again, but what you can do is look at what's happened in this example of evolution on our planet, and what you find is that it's highly, highly convergent. Right? There's a lot of examples of adaptations that have risen in multiple lineages independently. So there's one example here of the camera-like eye that we have. It emerged in vertebrates and also emerged in mollusks. So the same, it's not identical, but a very similar functional structure emerged evolutionary twice. Okay? Why? All right? Is it because that's a really good solution given the chemistry and physics and the environment that we find ourselves in? Or is it just by chance? Well, if that was the only example, you say, well, it's just by chance. But like evolution is riddled with convergence. There's not a single sensory system that didn't evolve multiple times. Like echolocation evolved multiple times. Smell evolved multiple times. Right? So this book is one of my favorite books about evolution. This is called Life Solutions, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe by Simone Conway Morris. And it goes in example after example of convergence in evolution. Right? Photosynthesis, for example, there's plants that fix carbon with 3 carbons, and then there's the C4 ones. So the C4 ones evolved from the C3 ones, but they evolved 60 different times. Right? So there's 60 examples of evolution where the C3 evolved to the C4. So it's highly, highly convergent, right? Which suggests there's some underlying order or pattern. There's certain solutions that are going to work. So if we reran evolution again, we would get certain patterns. And I think this is because of the underlying chemistry and physics of the universe. And the best example of this that I can use is protein evolution, because this sort of illustrates the massive amount of convergence that goes on in evolution. Right? So what I'm going to argue is that given the physical and chemical structure and order of our universe, there's only certain protein folds that are stable. Right? They're stable because of the underlying physics and chemistry, which is a given. Evolution doesn't evolve the chemistry and the physics. It's a sort of a given to biological evolution. But because of that, there's certain solutions that are really robust and work. So if you reran evolution again, you're going to get the exact same protein folds. They might look slightly different. They might have slightly different sequences, but you're going to get the same folds. Right? And why do I say that? Okay? Well, I say that because if you look at how many possible proteins there are, right? So remember, if a protein is made up of these little balls of amino acids, little chemicals, right? So there's a cartoon of an amino acid up there at the top, or chemical structure of an amino acid. There's a cartoon of a protein down here. So protein is just a string of amino acids. You put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, string them together, and you get a protein, right? There are basically 20 biological amino acids, right? Proteins tend to be anywhere, on average, like 250 amino acids long, right? But just think, how many possible sequences of amino acids can you come up with if a protein is 100 amino acids long? It'd be 20 to the 100th power, okay? So it's basically an infinite number of primary sequences, amino acid sequences that proteins can be made of. You have this infinite space of sequences, right? If you take those infinite sequences of spaces, what do they fold into? Okay? So with proteins, there's primary structure, which is just the amino acids, just A, B, which amino acid there. Then there's secondary structure, and it's the first amount of folding that the proteins undergo. Well, you have this basically infinite number of sequences. They only fold into 2 secondary structures. An alpha helix, which is right there on the left, and then a beta sheet, which is a flat sheet on the right. So you could take all this sort of infinite array of sequences, and they only go into 2 structures. Why? It's because of the chemistry and the physics. These are the only 2 stable structures given the structure of amino acids. Right? Now, they could just clump into a ball and do nothing. That's a possibility, too. So I'm not saying that they will always go. But the only 2 really stable structures that they'll form are these 2. There's a high amount of convergence. Right? And then these 2 structures will only fold. You can combine them in only a certain number of ways. And this is the tertiary structure. So what you see in these tertiary structures, these are called protein folds. These blue ones are the alpha helices. These pink ones are the beta sheets. But what you see is just different combinations of beta sheets and alpha helix. There's really nothing else there. And there's different ways you can have a barrel where all the alpha helices are on the outside, the beta sheets are inside. You have a sandwich, you have like a hot dog roll type thing. There's only a limited ways you can put alpha helices and beta sheets together. And every time a biochemist determines a protein structure, they take it and get the protein structure through crystallizing the protein. They'll put it into the database. So there's a protein database, right? There are only 1,000 folds in that database. So every time somebody now finds a structure, a new protein, and so the fold, they go put it in the database. Oh, it's already there, right? So at this point, there hasn't been a new fold in the last couple of years that somebody's been identified, because we sort of found the 1,000 folds that work, and there really aren't any more. And why are those 1,000 folds there? Well, it has to do with the underlying chemistry, right? So the folds that exist depend upon the elements that exist, right? Why do we only have those elements, right? Why are there only 90-some really stable elements? You can make others, but they're not stable, right? Why are these, and why are they in a certain abundance? Well, these elements are there and are stable because of why those atoms are stable because of the subatomic forces and the subatomic particles. And you can keep going down and down until you reach a level where you have, this is just the fundamental physical equations. And they're ordered and structured in a way that we can describe, but we can't explain. There's a fundamental order at the physics that allows only these atoms to exist, which allows only these amino acids to exist, which allows these proteins to exist, and these protein folds are stable. So if you rerun evolution again with the same physics and the same chemistry, what are you going to get? You're going to get alpha helices and beta sheets, and you can only fold them into a certain number of ways, so you're going to get the same type of proteins again. Now, their actual sequence, their primary sequence might be different, but there's going to be the same sort of structures again. And the proteins are the key to making up the structure of organisms, right? And so that would then dictate certain structures are going to be stable, okay? So the idea is that the order at each level emerges from an underlying order at a lower level. And so the order of me, is because of the order in the protein. That's why I'm stable, as I don't, I have a structure, if you look, I don't change, my nose doesn't suddenly get big, and I have a stable sort of body. It's because the proteins that make me up have a certain order and stability. And those proteins have an order and stability because the atoms do. And the atoms have an order and stability because of the subatomic particles and the forces that hold those together. There's an underlying order, and there's a source of that order, and that order dictates what works in evolution. And sort of the chance is sort of finding those things that are going to work. But what's going to work is already known in a sense, right? It's out there because the chemistry and physics dictates it, right? And I think this leads to a different way of looking at the universe. So you can say, well, evolution relies upon chance events. This demonstrates that the universe has no purpose, no design, and no creator, right? So you can look at that. But that is flawed in two ways. One, just because there's something that's chancy doesn't mean that there's no purpose behind it. And two, I don't think chance is the key factor in evolution. Chance is sorting through and finding the things that already work. And a better way of looking at it is that the universe is ordered at its most fundamental level, right? And evolution in naturalism is entirely dependent upon this order. You won't get any evolution if you don't have stable atoms, right? So dependent upon that order. And that order dictates some of the solutions. So if you reran evolution, you sort of could predict what would come out of it. And so evolution outcomes are highly influenced by that order. All right? And I think it's a totally different way. Now, the question then is, why do we live in an ordered universe? And that's not a scientific question, but that's a question I think demands an answer that if you look at evolution in this fashion, that's the question, not so much as why is there so much chance involved. Okay? So to end, so look, this is a quote from John Paul II. He says, "Does an evolutionary perspective bring any light to bear on theological anthropology, the meaning of the human person as the imago Dei, the problem of Christology, even upon the development of doctrine itself?" Right? This is what we understand, what we can learn scientifically. It's not theology, but it is a way of knowing the world that God has created. So does that help inform our understanding of God and how he interacts with us? And vice versa, as a biologist, my understanding of what God is and how he interacts with the world informs how I look at and the way I'm going to interpret my scientific data and look at it. What sort of, it's going to determine to a larger extent or influence to a larger extent which one of these I might find more resonant and more cohere with my theological understanding of what it means to be human. Right? And so evolution can enlighten our theological understanding of God and creation, but you have to proceed with caution and humility. Evolution is not going to dictate to theology what it has to do. Right? Just like theology is not going to dictate to evolution if you're doing it scientifically. Right? If it leads and becomes a philosophy, then it has every right to sort of dictate things. Well, and that's where I'll end. Okay? So thanks.